The grocery bag nearly slipped from Ethan Parker's hand. Standing on the front porch wasn't the elderly woman he'd visited almost every afternoon for the past 8 months. Instead, the front door swung open to reveal the one face he never expected, or wanted, to see again. Richard Calloway. The CEO who had ended Ethan's career with a 5-minute meeting and a single sentence. "We're restructuring. Security will escort you out." For a long second, neither man spoke. Richard stared at the paper bag filled with fresh bread, soup, milk, and blueberries. Ethan stared at the man who had unknowingly changed his life forever. Finally, Richard asked quietly, "You know Margaret?" Ethan swallowed. "I thought I did." 8 months earlier, Ethan's life looked completely different. At 38, he wasn't wealthy. He wasn't chasing promotions anymore. He simply wanted stability. As a widowed father raising his 11-year-old daughter Lily in Columbus, Ohio, predictable days were priceless. He worked as a project coordinator for a large technology company. The hours were reasonable. The paycheck covered rent, groceries, soccer cleats, piano lessons, and the occasional Friday night pizza tradition with Lily. Life wasn't glamorous. But it felt safe. Then came the corporate announcement. The company was repositioning for long-term growth. Everyone recognized the phrase. Layoffs. Employees gathered in tense silence. Managers avoided eye contact. Conversations stopped whenever executives walked by. Ethan kept working, convincing himself that 10 years of loyal service had to mean something. It didn't. On a rainy Tuesday morning, his calendar suddenly filled with an invitation titled HR meeting. He knew before walking inside. Richard Calloway sat beside the HR director. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Richard wasn't cruel. He wasn't loud. He simply looked tired. "I'm sorry," Richard said. This decision wasn't personal. But to Ethan, it felt deeply personal. His desk was packed into a cardboard box before lunchtime. As security walked him toward the elevator, Ethan glanced back one last time. 10 years. Reduced to one cardboard box. Finding another job wasn't easy. Companies praised his experience. Then chose someone else. Weeks became months. Savings shrank. Every purchase became a calculation. Lily noticed before Ethan admitted anything. She stopped asking for movie nights. Stopped mentioning new shoes. One evening she quietly said, "My sneakers still fit." They didn't. The front seams had split open. Ethan pretended not to notice because pretending hurt less than admitting he couldn't replace them immediately. To save money, they moved into a smaller rental house across town. It wasn't fancy. But it had a tiny porch where Lily grew tomatoes in old coffee cans. Their next-door neighbor was Margaret Sullivan. 78. Silver hair. Quick smile. Always waving from her flower garden. The first week Ethan moved in, he noticed newspapers piling up near her front steps. 2 days later they were still there. He knocked. No answer. Concerned, he called through the door. A weak voice finally answered. "I slipped." She wasn't seriously injured. Just unable to get up easily after twisting her ankle. Ethan helped her into a chair and called her daughter. Margaret laughed afterward. "Well, that's one way to meet the neighbors." That afternoon changed everything. Every couple of days Ethan checked on her. Soon every couple of days became every day. Not because anyone asked. Because kindness often grows quietly. He shoveled her sidewalk after snowstorms. Changed hard-to-reach light bulbs. Carried groceries. Fixed loose cabinet doors. Reset the confusing television remote. Lily joined him. She watered Margaret's flowers. Read library books aloud when Margaret's eyes became tired. Helped organize old family photographs. Margaret became family in every way except blood. One afternoon Lily asked, "Why do you help her even when we're busy?" Ethan smiled. "Because someday we'll need someone too." Margaret overheard from the kitchen. Her eyes quietly filled with tears. Months passed. Job interviews continued. Rejections continued. Still, Ethan never skipped his afternoon visit. Sometimes they only talked for 10 minutes. Sometimes they shared dinner. Sometimes Margaret simply appreciated knowing someone would knock before sunset. Then one Friday. No answer. Ethan frowned. He knocked again. Still nothing. His stomach tightened. Using the emergency key Margaret had once insisted he keep, just in case, he stepped inside. The house was empty. A suitcase was gone. Several family photos were missing. A handwritten note rested on the kitchen table. "Dear Ethan and Lily. My daughter insisted I stay with family for a while after my recent health checkup. I argued. She won. Please don't worry. You have brought more comfort into my life than you'll ever understand. I'll explain everything soon. Love, Margaret." Weeks passed without another word. Ethan worried but respected her privacy. Life continued. He finally accepted temporary contract work renovating office buildings. The pay was lower. The hours longer. But it was honest work. 3 weeks later. His phone rang. Unknown number. "Hello? Ethan?" "Yes. It's Margaret." Relief flooded through him. "Are you okay?" "I am. I've missed our visits." "I've missed them too." There was a pause. Then she asked, "Would you mind bringing me one of your favorite sourdough loaves tomorrow afternoon?" He laughed. "You called me for bread? And blueberry muffins. I can do that. I'll text the address." The neighborhood surprised him. Large trees. Beautiful homes. Perfectly trimmed lawns. He checked the address twice. Surely this couldn't be right. The navigation insisted it was. He carried the grocery bag to the front porch. Knocked. The door opened. Richard Calloway stood there. Both men froze. Neither expected the other. Richard looked equally stunned. "You?" Ethan slowly nodded. "I think I'm at the right address." Before Richard could answer, Margaret's cheerful voice floated from the living room. "Ethan. Is that you?" She appeared with the help of a cane. Her smile lit up instantly. "Oh good, you brought the bread." She hugged Ethan tightly. Only then did she notice the awkward silence. "You've met my son." Ethan blinked. "Your son?" Richard looked almost embarrassed. "Margaret never mentioned me." Margaret smiled sadly. "You never asked." They sat together in the family room. Richard finally broke the silence. "I owe you an explanation." Ethan wasn't interested. "You don't owe me anything." "I think I do." Richard looked toward his mother. "I had no idea someone had been helping her every day." Margaret interrupted gently. "You never asked." Richard closed his eyes. She wasn't wrong. Running a Fortune 500 company consumed nearly every waking hour. Conference calls. Flights. Board meetings. Quarterly earnings. He called his mother every Sunday. Sent flowers. Paid every medical bill. But he rarely visited. He assumed writing checks meant he was taking care of her. He hadn't realized loneliness couldn't be solved with money. Margaret reached for Ethan's hand. "This young man gave me something no one can buy." Richard quietly asked, What? She smiled. Time. Silence settled over the room. The kind of silence that forces people to hear uncomfortable truths. Richard looked directly at Ethan. When we eliminated your department. Ethan interrupted politely. I know. No. You don't. Richard leaned forward. I signed hundreds of layoffs that month. He rubbed his forehead. At the time they were names on spreadsheets. He paused. Seeing you here. He looked around the living room. I suddenly realize every one of those names belonged to someone's father. Someone's neighbor. Someone's friend. Someone who carried groceries for my mother. For the first time since losing his job, Ethan saw something he'd never imagined. Regret. Not corporate regret. Human regret. Margaret stood slowly. You boys need to stop talking like executives. She smiled. Go fix my squeaky gate. Both men laughed despite themselves. Outside, they worked side by side. At first conversation stayed practical. Pass me the screwdriver. Hold this. Careful. Then Richard quietly said. I've spent years believing leadership meant making hard decisions. He tightened another bolt. My mother reminded me today that leadership also means understanding who those decisions affect. Ethan nodded without speaking. Over the next several weeks something unexpected happened. Richard kept calling. Not about jobs. About ideas. He wanted Ethan's perspective. What did employees actually need? What did managers miss? What made good people stop trusting leadership? Ethan answered honestly. Sometimes the answers were uncomfortable. Richard listened anyway. Months later, Richard invited Ethan to visit company headquarters. Not for an interview. For a conversation. Executives filled the conference room expecting another strategy presentation. Instead, Richard introduced Ethan. This is the man who unknowingly taught me the biggest leadership lesson of my career. The room fell silent. Ethan shared no dramatic speeches. Just simple observations. People remember how they're treated on ordinary days. They don't expect perfection. They do expect dignity. And kindness is never wasted inside a company. Several executives took notes. Not because they had to. Because the words felt true. A year later, Ethan wasn't merely employed again. He led a new employee engagement program designed around respect, communication, and community service. The company began offering volunteer hours for employees helping local neighborhoods. Managers visited retirement communities. Teams partnered with schools. Employees were encouraged to know the people behind the job titles. It didn't solve every workplace problem. No company ever could. But something changed. People began seeing one another more clearly. Margaret loved hearing the stories. Every Thursday evening Ethan and Lily still visited. Only now Richard often joined them. Sometimes he brought dessert. Sometimes flowers. Sometimes absolutely nothing except his time. Margaret always insisted that was enough. One autumn afternoon Lily walked beside Richard after helping rake leaves. Can I ask you something? Of course. Were you scared to say you were sorry? Richard smiled thoughtfully. Very. What happened? I discovered saying sorry wasn't the hardest part. What was? Changing afterward. Lily nodded as though storing the answer for later in life. Years later, when people asked Ethan how he rebuilt everything after losing his job, they expected him to mention persistence. Networking. Hard work. Resilience. Those mattered. But that wasn't his answer. He always smiled and said. It started with checking on a neighbor. Because the truth was simple. He never helped Margaret hoping she'd know someone important. He never expected a reward. He never imagined she'd be the mother of the man who had fired him. He helped because she looked lonely. Because carrying groceries takes only a few minutes. Because listening costs nothing. Because kindness doesn't ask whether someone can repay you. It simply shows up. Sometimes with fresh bread. Sometimes with a repaired gate. Sometimes with a quiet conversation on a front porch. And every now and then, the smallest act of compassion reaches farther than anyone could possibly imagine. Not because it changes the world overnight, but because it changes people. One heart at a time. So if there's someone in your neighborhood who could use a helping hand, an elderly neighbor, a struggling parent, a lonely coworker, or someone who's simply carrying more than they let others see, don't wait for the perfect moment. Knock on the door. Offer the ride. Carry the groceries. Share a little of your time. You may never know where that kindness will lead. But you'll always know it was worth giving. And sometimes, the greatest opportunities in life don't arrive through open office doors. They begin with an open front door, and a heart willing to step through it.